All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. I am Andrew, aka Capitalist Mindgasms, for the purposes of this video. And I'm going to talk about Guattari's book called Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist. He was the co-author, along with Deleuze, of books like A Thousand Plateaus, which I've talked about a long time ago with my philosopher friend Tim Keefe, aka Chief Keefe. So check that chat out if you want to. But he was basically a Marxist, but he was a Marxist in a different way from other Marxists, and more in a more modern way. But we'll get to that. And so obviously, the as you can see in the banner there, his idea in the essay can basically be interpreted as him comparing capitalism directly to fascism. So he obviously really hated fascism. And I'm going to apply this idea from this essay to the recent news that Elon Musk became majority shareholder of Twitter, and along with discussions about whether he could make there be more freedom of speech on Twitter and there isn't suppression, and there's discussion about him potentially allowing Trump to be back on Twitter somehow. I don't know if he would actually have the authority to do that, and we know of other examples of Twitter suppressing freedom of speech, like people getting canceled for that. And obviously that New York Post article about the Hunter Biden laptop being prevented from anyone being able to share it, along with other things of that nature, like you can't talk about lab leak theory, for example. In fact, I might have just gotten this video banned for that, because that's something like that has happened before. But anyway, this freedom of speech issue in terms of Trump can be interpreted as the fascism of capitalism if you look at it that way in terms of Guattari's essay. And he also talks about fascism as shown in the example of the Nazis in World War II, and how there's this mass psychological capture of the ideology of capitalism and seeking materialistic goals that he discusses in the essay. So that's just a little preamble to say, keep all that in mind. Well, we're watching this. I'm going to start off with this breaking points video about Elon Musk, and then go into this theory of philosophy video on Felix Guattari's Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist, and give my thoughts on it. So I will screen share the breaking points video with Crystal Ball, the progressive populist, and Sagar and Jetty, the conservative populist. They have a really interesting news channel. So I'm going to play this and comment on it. Okay.
Let's move on to a more fun story. Elon Musk and Twitter. What a whirlwind of things that have happened here. So we brought you previously the news that Elon Musk had bought about a 9.7% stake in Twitter, which makes him officially the largest shareholder of that company. That spawned all sorts of takes because Elon has much more of a free speech view and wants to change.
Okay, so first of all, they're 9%. If the majority shareholder owns 9% of the company, I highly doubt that he would have the authority to make decisions such as reinstituting Trump on Twitter or make any majority decisions, because even though 9% is the majority percentage of the shareholder with the highest percentage, that's nowhere near 50% of the company, which is half of control of it, obviously, right? So he still has a minority of the entire control of the company. So I don't know the rules of Twitter, the way it's structured in terms of the levels of power that someone has, but I highly doubt that he would have that level of power if that's the case.
The product. So then Twitter announced that after discussion with Elon, the CEO said that Elon Musk would be joining the board of directors. Now, why that's important is because Elon, if he joined the board of directors, would be subject to fiduciary responsibilities as a member of the board, meaning that he could not take actions publicly which could possibly impact the stock price, which would open up shareholder lawsuits. But number two, and this was underreported, was that as part of his shareholder agreement with the board of directors, was he said is that he would not acquire more than a 14.9% stake in the company, meaning that he would not increase his ownership stake, which could then lead to the grounds for a hostile takeover. That was the ground that was set.
Okay, that's interesting though, because it seems like he would not, like Sager just said, he would not, Elon Musk will not increase his ownership rate to 14.5%. So you only have to have, is that implying that you only have to have 14.5% of the company in order to do a hostile takeover? And also, what does that mean exactly?
Until yesterday morning, when Parag Agarwal made a shock announcement, he's the CEO of Twitter. Let's put this up there on the screen. He says, Elon has decided not to join our board. Now, here's the note that he sent to his team, and I'm going to read a lot of this. Elon Musk has decided not to join our board. Here's I can share what happened. The board and I had many discussions about Elon joining the board with Elon directly. We were excited to collaborate and clear about the risks. We also believed having Elon as a fiduciary of the company, where he, like all board members, has to act in the best interest of the company and our shareholders, was the best path forward. The board offered him a seat. We announced on Tuesday Elon would be appointed to the board contingent on a background check and formal acceptance. Elon's appointment to the board was to become officially effective on 4/9. But Elon shared that same morning he will no longer be joining the board. I believe this is for the best. We have and will always value input from our shareholders, whether they are on the board or not. Elon is our biggest shareholder. We will remain open to his input. There will be distractions ahead, but our goals and priorities remain unchanged. The decisions we make, how we execute, is in our hands, no one else's. Let's tune out the noise and stay focused on the work and what we're building. All eyes.
Wow, that's like super fucking vague and can mean a hell of a lot of different things depending on your interpretation, right?
On that last paragraph. There will be distractions ahead.
Sounds ominous.
There is a particular little hint as to what happened. Let's put this up there on the screen, which is Elon actually deleted a lot of his tweets, which were critical of the Twitter product, but a very conspicuous like, which said this in response. Let me break this down for you. Elon became largest shareholder for free speech. Elon was told to play nice and not to speak freely. And Musk actually liked that tweet. Now, the reason that this matters, Crystal, let's go ahead and put the CNBC piece up on the screen, is that Elon is no longer bound now by the agreement that he made with the board not to take up to a 14.9% stake in the company.
Oh, if you're making that interpretation, though, that's kind of backwards, because if he's declining a role on the board, then that would give him less power for if he wanted to do a hostile takeover, because he said he wouldn't increase the ownership percentage of his company. Maybe they're just talking about the percentage of the company that he buys, because he could do a hostile takeover by buying more of it. But wouldn't you still have to be on the board of directors to make those decisions, regardless of the percentage of the company that you own? I don't know how that works and how it's structured exactly. But just take that with a grain of salt for that reason.
Company. He could now, if he wanted to, pursue a hostile takeover of the company, where he could acquire as much of a share as he wanted within the company and then cobble together other pieces with large shareholders or possibly even retail shareholders and force changes both at the CEO board level, but also in terms of governance at the company itself. So this could...
Oh, I also wanted to say, so just think about this in terms of Guattari's essay, Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist. So Guattari is against both, he's kind of against both massive... I hope you can still see me here. Okay, I think my internet cut out for a second. So the way Guattari sees it is that capitalism is basically inherently fascistic. So if you look at it from that perspective, that and I don't look at it from this perspective personally, but if you look at it from that perspective, then you can obviously see that because Elon Musk is this super fucking rich billionaire, he can basically, they're implying anyway, Sager is that he can essentially control Twitter if he wants to, which is like, it is actually a valid point. You don't have to be a Marxist to agree with that simple observation that Elon Musk, because he's so filthy rich, can just buy a majority shareholder ownership of Twitter because that's what he did, right?
This could have an extraordinary impact on Twitter, the company. Now, the real question, obviously, everyone's asking is, why should I care? Well, because Twitter, yes, by only having 300 million daily active users, is disproportionately impactful on the elites of news, of politics, sports, pretty much everything. And so with that disproportionate impact, their content policy,
so
how
news, politics, sports, pretty much everything, three different areas of culture is far from everything, but I get the point that it encompasses a lot of culture, and people often report and make YouTube videos about what's happening in the news, and that's I mean, that's what a lot of people talk about on Twitter. And even though that's not the majority of people in the entire world or even the entire US, which they're talking about specifically here, they have a disproportionate amount of power over the culture overall. So I can see that point for that reason.
Company is run and more has a huge impact on the way that you receive information from basically all aspects of your entire life.
Yeah, I mean, just to be, give you one really specific example, is Trump going to be on Twitter during the next campaign, right? I mean, just that decision alone is extraordinarily consequential. And it's not just the possibility that Elon could execute a hostile takeover here. It's also that if he was sitting on the board, he would have a fiduciary responsibility to act in the best interests of the company and of its shareholders specifically. Now that he's not at the board,
is it in his fiduciary responsibility to put Trump back on Twitter, though? If that's the argument that she's making, maybe she's not, but if that's the argument that Crystal's making, then I don't see how you could see that as his fiduciary responsibility, because, well, I don't know, maybe Twitter made a lot more money when Trump was on there, but maybe maybe most of the shareholders of Twitter were against that, and that's why part of the reason that they took Trump off of Twitter. But even if Elon Musk has majority ownership, will that mean that he represents the entire fiduciary responsibility of the company? I mean, especially if he's not on the board, as he said he would not be, I don't see how he could make that decision all by himself like a dictator. But again, I'm not 100% sure about the way Twitter is structured as a company.
On the board, he's not under that obligation. So it wouldn't have to go so far as a hostile takeover. You can understand. So I can understand why, the CEO, the board members, the other major shareholders, I can understand why they're nervous about this. Because ultimately, regardless of how you feel about, Elon's ideology versus Parag Agrawal, this is also about control. It's about power, and it's about who actually is directing the future of this platform, which is extraordinarily significant and central to our ability to communicate and the way elites process information in this country. So I understand why they're kind of freaked out, but there's a lot of reporting of employees freaking out, which makes a little bit less sense to me. I mean, I guess ultimately it's also, they're probably more comfortable with Parag's interpretation of, his basic rejection.
So that's a new Twitter CEO, if I understand correctly.
Of the First Amendment.
Because Jack, whatever his name is, left. I'm going to look that up right now. What is his name? I'm going to keep playing that while I look it up.
And free speech. So they are nervous about what this will ultimately mean for them. I mean, you guys know my overall view is, I feel about Elon the way I feel about every billionaire. They are acting in their own self-interest. He has used
Jack Dorsey. That's of course, that's the former CEO of Twitter. I forgot his name.
Twitter in ways that has been sanctioned by the SEC. even in this deal, let's go ahead and put the next element up on the screen. So he waited to file his disclosures with the SEC 11 days. So he was 11 days late in publicly declaring that he had amassed a large stake in Twitter. So once you acquire a certain amount, you're supposed to immediately publicly disclose that. So he was 11 days late in doing that. While he was doing that, he continued to acquire Twitter stock at that low price. Then once after belatedly his stake is disclosed, of course, the Twitter stock price went through the roof, and he personally benefited to the tune of $159 million. 156, sorry. So here's the Washington Post. Elon Musk delayed.
Okay, so again, if you look at this from the perspective of what Guattari is talking about in Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist, it seems really applicable, because Elon Musk, he did all this like circumnavigating of filing forms and delaying filing a form so he can make an extra $156 million, even though he already has billions. So even if he is a really honest and morally good person, and some people argue about that, it obviously depends on your political ideology. Lefties tend to like him way less than right-wingers. But giving him the benefit of a doubt that he's a morally good person, then that's even more evidence for Guattari's argument that someone like Elon Musk is the epitome of someone who has been psychologically captured by capitalism, because it's so embedded into our modern Western culture that this capitalistic pursuit of materialism and just making more money is such a part of the overall ideology of our culture that you're just automatically going towards the goal of making money just to make more money. So you could definitely make that argument in terms of Guattari's essay.
Delayed filing a form and made $156 million. I mean, this is securities fraud, whether it was intentional or incidental. He ends up, as billionaires always do, on top. Even if the SEC ends up fining him for this, he made $156 million. The fine is liable to be a couple of $100,000 at the most. So he makes a massive profit here. And this harkens back to other ways he has used Twitter to his own benefit. Back in 2018, he had to enter into a consent decree with the Securities Exchange Commission for allegedly misleading investors when he tweeted he'd gathered enough funding to take Tesla private. Musk paid a $20 million fine and agreed to step down as chairman and vet his tweets with lawyers. Last month, he asked the SEC to scrap that agreement. He also has pushed the rules by polling him.
See, look at that too. You can say, you could even make the argument in that example that the corporation of Twitter itself is behaving like a fascist in the terms of its capitalistic structure. If you look at it from the perspective of Guattari's essay again, which again, I don't, because I'm not a Marxist, but his perspective on it is still interesting and valid in that one way. I think from the perspective of both Elon Musk and Twitter, you could say that capitalism and the pursuit of materialism and just making money for the sake of making money is so embedded into our modern Western culture that both Twitter and Elon Musk are just trying their best to make more money as much as possible. And that's why there's so many of these issues with free speech, because the SEC it has having issues with his tweets over the amount of money that he makes. So they're directly related in that way.
Polling his Twitter followers on whether he should sell a 10% stake in Tesla. The Wall Street Journal also reported in February the SEC was investigating a stock sale by Musk's brother a day before that tweet. All of this is to say that he may be genuinely committed to free speech, but also keep in mind that his free speech on Twitter is something that he has used in order to profit him directly. My overall view here is that with all of these tech companies these tech giants and the problems that they have created for discourse in the public square, the answer is not going to be to sort of like libertarian entrepreneur our way out of it. There's going to have to be government regulation, because we cannot depend on the whims of which billionaire happens to be at the helm for when all of our public discourse ultimately depends on these platforms. So,
okay, so this is interesting because, as I'll get into when I'm talking about the essay itself, Guattari's essay, Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist, it seems to me that Guattari was both anti-capitalist but also anti-government. So I don't know this for sure because I've only read a few of his books, but I kind of doubt that Guattari would be for government regulation of Twitter for this reason, because he was anti-capitalist and anti-government, which is why he reminds me of some classic Marxists, which were really anti-capitalist, like Bakunin and Kropotkin, who anarcho-capitalists and anarchists like Dave Smith and Michael Malice never mention. But yeah.
if he wants to get involved in being part of that broader solution and not just sort of screwing around with Twitter here, that would be something I would be much more interested in.
Yeah, and part of the issue too is assembling a hostile takeover like coalition would just be very difficult. I went ahead and pulled who the other top investors are in the company. It's Vanguard, Morgan Stanley, BlackRock, and State Street Corp.
Cool.
Good luck convincing
wow.
them in order to join a coalition so that you can enforce more free speech policy.
If you haven't heard of BlackRock, they're Breaking Point's Crystal and Sager have talked about them before. They did this massive buyout of houses, which prevented middle class and lower class people from being able to buy them because it drove up the prices in the market. I think it was, I think the details might be a little different, but I'm pretty sure that's what happened.
Those people benefit from not having more free speech on the platform. The other issue here, which is kind of interesting, is that Twitter's governance structure is actually set up differently than all other companies. So, for example, Facebook and Google are set up such that Zuckerberg and Sergey Brin and I'm forgetting his name, Larry Page, all have mega controlling voting power in the company.
Right.
Meaning that even though they don't own the vast majority of shares, they set it up as like a Class A and a Class B structure, where Class B shares have 10 times the voting power of a Class A share, which means that they'll always remain in total control of what they can do. Twitter does not have that because they don't have a single founder. They had a founding team and they've had a real mess of a governance structure. So they're actually much more rife for hostile takeovers, but it also makes it so that all these investors can throw their weight around. So that there could be a big fight here is more what I'm saying. Elon is not the de facto winner by any means.
Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe they're just making this out to be a little more than it is. Again, I respect both of them, but maybe they're just playing up the drama here.
There's also a real possibility that he's basically just trolling. I mean,
oh yeah, definitely.
You know, I mean, that's certainly a possibility here, is he's just being sort of a shit disturber and trolling and throwing his billionaire weight around. Because, I mean, listen, this is a guy who's got a lot of other stuff going on. Is he really, like, if you were going to actually do the hostile takeover and then, you know, influence them in this way or that way and sort of take control of the helm, like, that takes a lot of time and a lot of focus. And he's certainly got the money to do it, but does he have the personal bandwidth or desire to make that a core part of what he's up to? I think that's a big
He's building two other companies. The vast majority of his attention should be on Tesla and SpaceX. I would frankly prefer it that way. But, you know, it's interesting nonetheless. I am enjoying the Twitter employees freaking out.
Yes.
Okay.
Indeed. Cable news is ripping.
Yeah, get your popcorn out. All right, so I'm going to jump right into this video from the Theory and Philosophy channel on Felix Guattari's essay called Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist. And so bear in mind that Crystal and Sager video about Elon Musk buying majority ownership of Twitter and the issues of free speech in terms of this essay, and capitalism basically being compared directly to fascism, like that of the Nazis in World War II.
Hey everyone, back again. Today we're going to talk about Felix Guattari's Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist. Now before jumping into it, if you want to follow me anywhere other than on here, you can find me on Instagram. If you're into that at all. If you're listening to this, if you found this on YouTube, you'll be able to find it in the philosophical journey. So if you're new, subscribe, leave a comment, like, share, tell your friends. That would help me out a lot. If you want to help me out monetarily, you can do that via Patreon or PayPal, but obviously no pressure. Let's talk about Guattari's text here. Everybody wants to be a fascist. So he's discussing fascism because it's a real problem. It's not some nebulous, speculative thing that doesn't have any effect in the real world. He was writing at a time, I think this was...
Okay, so again, I mentioned earlier, but he doesn't mention that who Guattari is. I don't know a hell of a lot about his biography, and he's probably going to explain some of it here. But he, like I said, he was a Marxist, but in a little bit of a different way than the traditional Marxist, maybe closer to a neo-Marxist from the Frankfurt School, like Adorno or Horkheimer, but I don't think he was exactly the same as a neo-Marxist like that. So yeah, bear that in mind. That's obviously why he's so biased against capitalism, of course.
This was in the early 70s or so. But anyway, in that kind of historical period, coming out of World War II, when we saw the fascisms, Stalinist fascism, German fascism, Italian fascism, American fascism, we saw all these fascisms ostensibly go away, right? But to Guattari, their spirit is still very much alive. And so this text is a way for him to describe how they're continuing and how they are...
See, that's actually a little interesting because it's kind of similar to Derrida's book, the post-structuralist philosopher who gets strawmanned all the time by people like Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay, about how in his book, The Spectres of Marx, he basically says things that are charitable about Marx, but he also criticizes it, yet he talks about how it's still... some of the cultural aspects of Marxism are embedded into our culture. So it's interesting because it's kind of like he's talking, it's not the exact same thing as what people call cultural Marxism, but he's kind of talking about that thing in a completely different way from the way that someone like Jordan Peterson talks about it. So that's one of endless ways that you know that Jordan Peterson is strawmanning people when he uses that term, particularly cultural Marxism.
The logic of fascism is found in each of us, and how we are very much, while predisposed might be kind of an extreme way to put it, we have a kind of propensity to fall for the trick of fascism. And so we have to be very careful. We have to be very much prepared to not do that. So in order for
that's an important and key aspect for this essay. So Guattari basically sees it as like part of almost like an essential part of human psychology. Not necessarily that it's part of human nature, but that human beings are extremely susceptible to fascistic impulses and joining fascist movements. And we can see that, like, just to go back to Twitter, look at how fucking tribal and politicized Twitter is, right? We can see, we can really look at those as appeals to the psychology of fascism in the way that Guattari talks about.
For an analysis of fascism to proceed, it must acknowledge its reality, as I've kind of already said. So what that means is engaging with it both in a kind of abstract way, that is a macroscopic way, looking at it broadly, and looking at it more specifically in its microscopic kind of manifestations, or looking at it microscopically. And he says that other approaches like psychoanalysis and Marxism are ill-equipped to do this because they are too quick to look at the broad, the kind of macroscopic elements of fascism, rather than on the microscopic ones as well. Now, for more on this, you have to really check out Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, where he and Deleuze really get into that problem a lot.
Yeah, I mentioned Deleuze. Guattari is the co-author with Deleuze about, as he mentioned, 1,000 Plateaus and Capitalism, or Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. So you obviously, from the subtitle of the second book, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, the argument in Anti-Oedipus is really interesting. I've read it, but I honestly don't even remember the details of the argument right now. But it's obviously talking about the Oedipus complex and talking about capitalism and looking at it as kind of like a biological organism. And I think he uses this term, a body without organs, as if there's the structure of a body, but none of the essential parts inside, so it's dysfunctional. But again, don't quote me on that because I don't remember the exact details of that book. But anyway, those books with Deleuze are really interesting, especially Thousand Plateaus, but it's super fucking abstract and hard to figure out, kind of like Foucault's more difficult books like A History of Sexuality, but even more so.
A lot, or at least in how they try to sketch a framework that is different than what psychoanalysis and in some cases what Marxism offers. Now, I frame it in that way because they are mostly concerned, and Guattari here is mostly concerned with psychoanalysis. He's totally dissatisfied with what psychoanalysis provides in terms of understanding the movements of fact.
So that's why it's interesting, and it's actually kind of similar to what someone like Adorno and Horkheimer do in their book called Dialectic of Enlightenment, which I did a video on before, and you should check out that one if you want to. And it's basically looking at fascism from the perspective of psychology and culture, and that's what Guattari's doing. He's looking at fascism from the perspective of psychology mainly, and he talks about ideology as well, I believe.
Of fascism, because psychoanalysis wants to think about fascism in terms of satisfying a lack, satisfying something that people desire. So it moves into the picture because it claims to offer what the masses need, which is true in part, but it hinges upon a very narrow understanding of desire. So Deleuze and Guattari do, and what Guattari just does in this text, is demonstrate that desire doesn't really have anything to do with a lack. Rather, desire is the demonstration of the formation of connections. Now, these connections happen on every single level. If I, for example, drink a cup of water, what is happening is there is a connection being formed between what they would call the mouth machine to the cup machine, which allows the flowing of the water machine into my...
So this is again in Anti-Oedipus, they kind of talk about this view of a human biological being as a machine and having these mechanical processes, and this relates to how again, I take this with a grain of salt because I might be messing up the details a little bit, but I think that's related to how capitalism has psychologically and ideologically captured everyone to the point that people just mechanistically just automate in an automated way, go through their lives like machines. So that's why they're using those sorts of terms.
My mouth, and then helps me keep going as a human. Now, the only way that that is possible is because, as well, you know, you have your finger machines holding the cup and your eye machines coordinating you and so on. Now, in that given moment, you are enacting, and each one of those components, each one of those machines is enacting a kind of desiring. They are desiring that action. But in doing so, they are...
See, that's where writers like Deleuze and Guattari get weird. Your finger machines are having desires through connections, bro.
Closing, they're doing another action. So, for example, if I am occupied with the cup machine in my hand, that means I can't be...
Why is it sad here? I'm going to stop screen sharing while this plays. And mute. Yeah, we are not going to watch that ad. Oh, I will screen share again here. Okay. Here we go. Oh, forgot to turn the sound back on. go back a few seconds here.
I am occupied with the cut machine in my hand. That means I can't be, I don't know, working with the baseball bat machine, if that's just one possible thing.
Everything
so
is a
in
machine.
doing that, I experience some degree of lack, but it's a lack that happens not in a broad way where you lack a kind of abstract desire, or in the case of psychoanalysis, women experience a lack in that they do not have a penis. These very broad things. So Deleuze and
Freud talks
Guattari
about
want to
that.
think about it in terms of rather very
Made a video before, check that out if you don't want to, called Freud's Transcendent Phallus. And Deleuze and Guattari, I believe it's in Anti-Oedipus that they use the term Freud's Transcendent Phallus because of him talking about that idea of penis envy, how women want to have penises. And so they basically talk about how Freud sees the idea of a penis as so amazing that it's basically transcended, which is why he thinks that women want to have penises.
Microscopic notions of lacking. Now, it's in this way that he, Guattari, paints fascism to be as effective as it is, because it doesn't tap into a broad form of an idea of lack like psychoanalysis would have it. It also seeps into these very microscopic forms of lack that happen between any two given little machines. So fascism taps into this because of its
lack between two little machines. That's why it gets like Deleuze and Guattari, both of them get really weird and abstract.
Capacity. It is able to speak to the bureaucrats. It is able to speak to the laborers. It is able to speak to the artisans. It is able to speak to the shop owners in ways that just totalitarianism is ill-equipped to do. And this is how Deleuze and Guattari, or in this case just Guattari here, draws a parallel between capitalist fascism and kind of fascism as we can historically conceive of it, because it is able to speak to people.
So he basically, like I said, he's talking about capitalism and fascism, but also in terms of directly saying that the Nazis in World War II and Hitler and the Nazis were an example of fascism as well. So comparing capitalism to fascism in the form of, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, every type of totalitarianism like that, basically.
On an individual level, in order to make them feel like they are being heard in their specific wants and specific needs, in their specific notions of lack. That is what in their specific.
So so again, to apply this to the news with Twitter and Elon Musk, you can basically look at how, if you're comparing capitalism to fascism, then you can say, just from the perspective of capitalism, then the totalitarian urge in human psychology in our modern Western culture in the form of Elon Musk is that form of capitalism as fascism, basically, according to Guattari anyway. And then also from the perspective of the other shareholders of Twitter, they're also part of they experience the psychological and ideological capture of capitalism as in the form of fascism, is probably something like how Guattari would put it, I think.
Specific lives, they are missing, not broad things like they are just lacking, like access to power, or lacking or experiencing or being threatened with a kind of castration in very broad way. It doesn't appeal to people in that way.
He doesn't mean, again, because Deleuze and Guattari use words in a very weird way. They don't mean castration in a literal way, like cutting off your balls. They mean rhetorical castration, basically.
It appeals to people in very specific ways. And I believe it was, I think it was Gary Janosco, who's, he's a scholar, Canadian scholar, who has written about Baudrillard and Guattari. He has an essay about this. I think it's only in French.
So Baudrillard was a post-structuralist philosopher, one of those post-structuralist philosophers who was labeled as postmodernists such as Foucault and Derrida, although Baudrillard was in much more recent history, and his book was misapplied to the Matrix. His book called Simulacra and Simulation, about how reality is basically a simulation, or not a simulation, a simulacra, which is kind of like a copy of a copy. So yeah, Baudrillard is a very interesting author.
In which he discusses how Trump relates to what Guattari was writing here, which is super interesting.
Oh, I didn't even remember that. That's actually an interesting coincidence how he's talking about Trump, and Trump is a piece of the Twitter aspect, because there's discussion about whether Elon Musk would be able to, and whether he would, if he did have the power, to let Trump back on Twitter, right?
Interesting. You can find it online if you're curious. So he likens this approach, this kind of anti-fascist approach, to what he first saw at the beginning of the May 68 student revolts and supposed, maybe not supposed, but kind of failed revolution in France, which, fun fact, at that time, he and Baudrillard were writing together for some French journal. It may have been Le Monde, or it could have been something smaller than that. Anyways, they were friends, and they were writing together, especially on this at that period. So he locates a kind of possible, revolutionary impetus in that movement, in that moment in May 68, in which there was not just an attempt to galvanize a single kind of group identity in response to fascism or fascist tendencies, but it was about also recognizing that fascism seeps into people's lives in very specific ways, and that to overcome that doesn't mean, transposing it with another group.
So that by fascism seeping into people's lives like that, again, he means like psychological fascistic impulses, and people being susceptible to joining movements and movements with tribalistic totalitarian political philosophies, basically.
A broad meta-narrative type identity structure that would just invariably regress into a kind of totalitarianism. It was instead about recognizing people's different positions in society, and some of the ways that he frames that is in terms of like class, gender, race, and how these different people are affected differently by fascist systems.
That's interesting, because you can apply that to Foucault. I've talked before about how he actually, contrary to what someone Jordan Peterson says, was basically against this endless creation of categories with 100 genders, because one of his main arguments in his book called The History of Sexuality is that the invention of the category of gay by the institutions of science and religion during the Enlightenment made a category that didn't exist before, because before then there were homosexuals, but they were not looked at as a separate category from heterosexual people. So they were not seen as medically flawed and inherently sinful, which the institutions of religion and science did during the Enlightenment. So if you look at that from Foucault's perspective on Guattari's essay here, you could say that you could even argue that perhaps that putting people into these strict boxes of categories is another example of the psychological and ideological of capture of fascism in our culture. Although I don't think that's where Guattari goes with it, to be fair.
So it's not about just replicating the logic of fascism by appealing to these differences. It is instead recognizing that people experience the world differently, and that's totally fine, and that there is therefore the risk that just because a system is able to speak your specific language or appeal to you in a specific way doesn't mean that it doesn't have this nefarious agenda. Now, what coheres them in terms of like possible political action is their mutual recognition of a desire that is separate, that is their own, yet it is still a recognition of a kind of disposition toward desire, toward experiencing these modes of kind of connections that I sketched earlier in every single one of our lives at every single point, that is not reducible to these broad movements and these broad kind of political efforts. So the Marxist idea about the working class in pretty broad terms is kind of not very satisfactory for Guattari. It's just way too reductive. It doesn't take people in their own terms. So it is only when
See, that's why Guattari is interesting, and why that's an example of how he's not a Marxist in the traditional way, because he talks like he just said, this category of the working class is too reductive because people are too different to be all categorized as this one group of people, because a lot of people in the so-called working class have very different political ideologies, just as different as anyone else can, right? That's one of many examples.
when we can recognize these implicit differences, these specificities, that we can begin to be wary or vigilant of the way that fascism is going to appropriate those specificities for its own use. And he kind of muses that perhaps this is why the United States was so late to jump into the war effort in World War II, was because they, or the kind of capitalism that they represented, very much recognized itself in the way that Hitler was mobilizing his fascism. He was speaking to the people in terms of their specific wants and desires, very much like the capitalist enterprise tends to do. He made kind of
So this is where it gets into the direct comparisons between capitalism and Nazis. And Nazis are an example of fascism here. So obviously that's super fucking anti-capitalist. And I don't endorse that. But again, Guattari's perspective on this is very interesting, I think.
Demonstrative appeals to the military without directly, or he didn't appoint, or he wasn't a kind of military person, but he was still firmly attached to the military. Now, the reason that that is attached to capitalism is that capitalism always tries to convince us that we are not, secretly under the control of the military. Like the market just regulates itself. Like these global oil futures.
Yeah, so that is interesting because, I mean, the only people who think the market regulates itself are hardcore libertarians or anarcho-capitalists. And I'm not an economist, but according to most economists that I've read books by and seen videos by across the political spectrum, the market sure as fuck does not regulate itself. You can argue about the degree of regulation it needs all day long, but to say that it requires none is kind of an ignorant way to look at it, in my opinion, which is why I can understand how someone would see that as fascistic or an example of fascism if you see that, because it can allow for a lot of authoritarianism. But I don't think that connection is inherent necessarily.
Are just, they just kind of work themselves out via the free market, as though there isn't a huge military apparatus that keeps that forms the kind of bedrock of capitalist global exploitation. But
See, that's interesting too, because the supposed military backbone of the capitalist institutions, those are government apparatuses. So this is another instance. This is why I like Guattari here too, because it's another instance of how it's a false dichotomy to be in my opinion, to be pro-capitalist but anti-corporation, or pro-capitalist but anti-government, or pro-government but anti-capitalist, because they're always kind of interconnected power structures. Usually there's the government. If there's a military backing of capitalism, then that means that there's a government backing of capitalism. So the governments support the corporations, and the corporations control the government. They both control each other. I mean, the degree to which one controls the other varies depending on the situation, and that kind of fluctuates a lot, I would say. So that's why it's just way too much of an oversimplified argument to say that capitalism is evil because it controls government and government is good, or government is evil because it controls capitalism, and government is inherently bad and capitalism is inherently good. Whether you think that government bad, capitalism good, or capitalism bad, government good, those are just way too oversimplified arguments.
It's kind of kept made hidden in the whole kind of soup of it all. Now, while Germany very much wanted to display its military might, at the same time, Hitler's role was not as a kind of military person per se, but he had those connections, and he did have that history, even though he wanted to speak to the people not in terms of military might per se, but in terms of their individual needs and wants. So why then did the US finally step in? Well, it went too far for capitalism. And he's just talking about this quite abstractly, even a little ironically to some extent. I don't think he actually thinks that this was the reason, but he thinks that if there was...
Yeah, like Deleuze and Foucault and Derrida and other authors I've mentioned, he kind of played around with words a little bit and was being a little bit ironic and just got kind of almost trolling, but not quite in the way that we would look at it today.
There was this similarity, or these similarities between capitalism and between German fascism, that the reason that finally capitalism, as it was kind of embodied by America, as it began not to see itself in Germany at the point when it became kind of collective death instinct on the part of the German military and the bureaucracy, where they kind of gave up and the masses were almost just predisposed towards death, like it was either victory or death. Now that's not effective. That's not very productive for the capitalist economy. And so it was at that point that it could say, okay, we can step in now because these aren't actually our secret allies in all of this. So we have these kind of three broad forms of fascism. We have German fascism, Stalinism, and American fascism in the form of capitalism, where German fascism, according to Guattari, kind of ate itself. It cannibalized itself. Stalin fascism was just totally geared towards military rule, so it avoided that kind of possible self-immolation, which capitalism didn't really jive with, because then that doesn't allow people to have the sense of their being atomized, of their being individualized for their own effort, working for their own desires.
Okay, again, maybe Guattari doesn't mean that literally, but that is a massive assumption, and I don't think that's necessarily an inherent connection.
Of course, it was too overtly repressive, but capitalism is the most effective for Guattari because it doesn't impose an overt control over people. It instead hides that control, makes it think that it's their own.
See, that's a good point, that it's more subtle and it can embed itself into your psychology and the ideology and politics of culture at large. I don't entirely agree with that conclusion, but it's a good argument. It kind of makes sense.
When in fact it is just these kind of micro-fascisms seeping in order to maintain a degree of control under the guise of a kind of freedom. Now we need what Guattari gives us in order to recognize these micro demonstrations, these kind of tentacles of fascism that seep into specific communities, specific individuals, the broader public in general, in order to impose these beliefs upon them. And yeah, that's pretty well it. If I did anything wrong,
Okay, all right. So yeah, I've been doing this for far too long. So basically, got to all of the points I made in my notes there. So yeah. Hopefully you found that interesting, connecting the idea of Guattari's essay, Everybody Wants to be a Fascist, and hopefully you understand now at least his argument about why he thinks that basically capitalism is a form of fascism, and the way he defines terms and his arguments are interesting based on his perspective, and especially his work with Foucault, or not with Foucault, his work with Deleuze, and also with Baudrillard at one point, and how this argument of seeing capitalism as a form of fascism can be applied to this recent news with Elon Musk becoming majority shareholder of Twitter, and the power of capitalism that someone like Elon Musk can have in the terms of his psychology, even perhaps in the pursuit of capitalism, and in Twitter's pursuit of capitalistic goals, of both parties' goals of just trying to make more money for the sake of making more money. So I think that's a really good example of that basic principle by Guattari. So I thought this would be interesting because I wanted to talk about that essay, and I thought it would be also interesting to apply it to recent events because it's kind of a deeper, more philosophical exploration of current events rather than just reacting to it and talking about it like most people do. So hopefully you found this interesting, and yeah, check out my upcoming videos, check out all of my most recent videos. I think my last Mindgasms quickie, and this is a quickie apparently, was on Jordan Peterson's Jordan Peterson spreading misinformation about ivermectin or ivergriftin, and also me critiquing his opinion on this new bill in Ontario, Canada called Bill 67, which is kind of an anti-racist bill, and how he inappropriately attaches or incorrectly, I should say, attaches this bill to all sorts of philosophies that he doesn't fucking understand at all, like critical race theory, critical theory, postmodernism, Marxism, all the usual targets of his. So check that out. Check out my last podcast with Dusty, in which we talked about Brett Weinstein and Heather Hang literally promoting the anti-vax conspiracy theory called mass formation psychosis, along with Jimmy Dore and this author Caleb Maupin, I believe his name is, them literally claiming that lefty YouTubers like Crystal Ball, who I analyzed her video with Sagar and Jetty earlier, obviously, along with the other lefty YouTubers like Kyle Kalinske and Sam Cedar and Cenk Uygur and Anna Kasparian at the Young Turk. Apparently, according to them, they're all CIA operatives, basically just because they disagree with Jimmy Dore. So anyway, check that out if you like that also, and look out for more philosophical videos soon as well. I'm also probably going to finally soon be talking with the philosopher, author, and political commentator Ben Burgess again about this AOC versus Crystal Ball drama over the Chris Small's Amazon union protests. And also we're going to talk about what I mentioned earlier, anti-capitalist anarchists like Bakunin and Kropotkin, who anarchists and anarcho-capitalists like Michael Malice and Dave Smith never mention, along with the philosophical tautologies and faith claims in some of the Austrian economists like Hans Hermann Hoppe and von Mises, who people like Dave Smith and in particular talk about a lot. And we're also going to talk about Alexander Dugin, this Russian kind of post-structuralist sounding conservative philosopher who supposedly has had a lot of influence on Putin's philosophy, although that's debatable, and lefties like Ben Burgess consider him to be a right-wing reactionary. So we're going to ideally talk about all of that. So look forward to that as well. And then this upcoming weekend, we're going to be talking about the book called Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie, who's a grimdark fantasy author, and I'm going to be discussing that with my friends Dusty and Tristram, my fantasy nerd friends who have discussed the Joe Abercrombie's previous trilogy called First Law before, and Best Served Cold is a standalone book in his First Law universe, and it's my favorite revenge story, so that'll be fun to get into. And yeah, check that all out. Subscribe to the channel, click that like button, share the video everywhere. Click that bell to be notified when I come out with all of those future videos, and please check out my Patreon. Even $1 a month is greatly appreciated. The link is in the description of the video as always. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And it's interesting to think more deeply about philosophical and political philosophical issues in terms of current events, because they're much more important and broader ideas in terms of history and our culture in the future than just focusing on this minutia of the news. So I thought it would be interesting to apply this to that, to kind of draw focus away from the minutia a little bit and get into more of a deeper discussion. So yeah, thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.